Good evening. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. I see some familiar faces and some new faces, so thank you for joining us. And we are so thrilled to welcome you to season 3 of Talking Food in Maine. And I want to start out by thanking our sponsors, Rising Tide, Co-op, Maine Magazine, and of course, King Iders, for supporting us in our 3rd season. We have a really exciting season this year. The whole theme is community through food. How do you build community with your point of view on food? And our first guest tonight, of course, is Rob Dumas, whom you are all very excited to meet shortly. And I'm going to hold off on that introduction, but we also have Chef Christian Hayes joining us in January, and we all know Chef Christian Hayes has one Chopped on the Food Network. But that's like the least of his accomplishments. The man's a legend. He just came back from Ukraine. He's done some incredible things up there. And he's also got some beautiful food work he's doing in Maine through Thoroughfare, Dandelion, and of course Garrison, which is an award-winning restaurant in Yarmouth. If you haven't been, definitely go check it out. And then of course in February, we have Mary Ellen Lindemann, who is the co-founder, and believe it or not, she signs her signature as / community builder of Coffee by Design. And Mary Ellen has the most fascinating story. It's a 30-year story in the making, and I feel like she's barely touched the surface of what she's going to accomplish. And so she's going to be on stage with us in February. And make sure you mark your calendars for our last and final guest, which is Barton Seaver. Barton is a leading worldwide seafood. He's just sort of a thought expert on that, and he is going to be joining us. He's also an award-winning chef, but he's become much more of a global educator on sustainable seafood. So we are so thrilled to have this great guest lineup. And without further ado, I want to make sure we thank our fabulous production team here at the Lincoln Theater. Christina Belknap is not with us tonight. She's our executive director and our fierce leader. And of course, we have Damon and Gary up in the wings there who have produced this entire show tonight. If you know of anybody who wasn't able to be here tonight, we put this entire thing online. In a few weeks from now, Damon will have produced it and put it on the YouTube channel. So make sure you share that with friends. But without further ado, I want to introduce Rob Dumas. Rob is a very, very special guest, and Rob is going to come on out.
Well, I came out maybe a little early there.
That's
Sorry about
all right.
that.
So have a seat, Rob. I'm going to talk about you while you're in the room. Okay. So Rob is really special to me. I met him 3 years ago at MOFGA when I went up for this fascinating day at MOFGA, learning about how to bring a recipe to market. And that was in the early stages of when I was planning out a simmer sauce line that I had in my head. And of course, Rob ended up becoming one of my contacts there. He gave a speech, and I pulled him aside and I said, listen, I'm launching a podcast with Maine Magazine. I really think you need to be one of my guests because you just had way too much to offer tonight. And so that started our friendship. 3 years later, here he is sitting in this seat. He should have been part of season 1, but I've saved him for season 3 because Rob is a community builder. And he is also Maine's innovative food scientist, and he works at the University of Maine producing some incredible products for big tastemakers and small tastemakers, and they're all important. And I feel like Rob's biggest challenge is yet to come because he's just always working on the next most incredible thing. So please join me in welcoming Rob Dumas.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm really excited about this because Rob told me at the last minute today that he had all of this produce sitting in his car, and all of this is from your garden, right, Rob?
That's correct.
And everything behind you is also from your garden.
Well, and it's out of gratitude to you, Cherie. I think you're an incredible person here in Maine. It's wonderful how you're telling the story of Maine's food system, and I just wanted to say thank you for being my friend, and thank you for the work you do.
Aw, thank you. You're so kind, and tonight's not about me, it's about you, so we're gonna turn back and put the spotlight back on you, Rob, because you've got some incredible things going on. Rob's like a walking food encyclopedia, so be careful what you say around him because he can actually talk about it for about 15 minutes knowledgeably. And you'll find that beans squash, and mushrooms are his love language. So I'm going to save that to the end so that he can talk about it. So Rob, tell us about, thank you for being here, first of all. We had an amazing dinner at King Iders. Thank you, King Iders.
Yeah, thank you, King Iders.
That was really delicious. We had a little too much fun. So tell us about what a guy from Slidell, Louisiana is doing up in Maine. Tell us about your childhood, what it was like growing up in the South.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up as a product of a military family, bounced around a good bit as a very young child. I was actually born in Kansas, though I have really no association with Kansas.
Yeah.
But spent my formative years in Louisiana. It was very, it was very important to kind of the beginning of my culinary journey. Louisiana's got an incredible heritage around food. It's one of the few states that kind of has its own cuisine. And I was lucky to grow up in that. I, kind of quickly fell in love with food as a young person. That food journey, as we'll kind of explore today, has been a twisting road that's taken me in a lot of interesting places, which I think is part of what makes food so amazing, and the message that I want to communicate to young people, especially working in culinary arts classrooms around Maine, is that food's an amazing journey.
It is, yeah.
You never know where it'll take you.
You had some particularly interesting sort of experiences with food. Tell us about your brother-in-law and your sister, who was 14 years older than you. Her name's Jeannie Brown. She's absolutely amazing. But tell us about what your childhood was like with her when you went to visit.
My sister met her husband when she was in college at the University of Southern Mississippi, the other USM.
USM, yep.
And I spent a lot of time with them as a young person, going and spending summers and spending weekends. And Charlie is just kind of like the big brother that everybody wishes they had. He's so enthusiastic about everything. He's full of good stories, and he's just got so much energy. And Charlie brought into my life this kind of excitement around food, and that everything about food could be special, that it could be something that you were intentional about and thoughtful about, right down to how you applied peanut butter to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
And what's the right way to do that per Charlie?
Absolutely, absolutely.
What is it?
You can't glob it all on in one big pile and mush up your bread. You've got to put it on in the four corners, and you've got to get a nice even spread so that when you eat your sandwich, you have an even layer of peanut butter and an even layer of jelly and an unmushed bread.
See, I've heard about doing the peanut butter on one side and the jelly on the other, and that smacks it together and keeps it together all day. So I'm going to actually try that out tomorrow morning with Justice's lunch.
Well, it's got to be even and not mushed.
Okay.
Or Charlie will not approve.
So you used to go and visit your sister because she was 14 years older than you. She was already in college, married. And so tell us about the fun adventures you had with her in the South.
Yeah. So as a young kid, one of the neat things about their life is they ended up living at Charlie's family's hunting camp in southern Mississippi, actually in a little town called Columbia. And they had an incredible piece of property along the Pearl River. And it was like, every redneck kid's dream, right? There was endless four-wheeler trails. There were swamps to play in. I had a pirogue, and I caught baby alligators. And, I got to go out we had leased farm fields.
Did you just say you caught baby alligators?
I did. I went out in the pirogue.
And what did you do with them?
I put them in a kiddie pool and fed them fish. And,
like they were little pets?
They almost were. They weren't very good pets because they would bite you, but...
That's so cool.
But it was really pretty neat, you got to check that off your card, being from Louisiana, that you've caught an alligator at some point,
Oh my gosh,
so I was glad
hilarious.
to do that, though I did it in Mississippi. But southern Mississippi, southern Louisiana, very comparable environment. I can vividly remember being in the cypress knee swamps. It's really almost an otherworldly environment with Spanish moss hanging off the trees. The tree roots actually grow up out of the water, which is very different from how tree roots grow up here. And so it's almost like these little spikes. And anyways, it's a neat environment. There's lots of birds, lots of reptiles and frogs, and it was neat. But I do not recommend catching alligators. That's not.
Have you ever eaten alligator?
I have, actually. Yeah, I've eaten
What does
a fair
that taste
amount.
like?
It's kind of like a tougher version of pork. It doesn't have a really pronounced flavor, but it is certainly pretty chewy. Though people will tell you shouldn't eat angry animals, and alligators are angry animals. So I don't know. I don't think alligator meat's going to become the next big thing.
So you were a latchkey kid, 28,000 people in Slidell, Louisiana. What did you do after school? You came home from school, and mom wasn't home. So how did you feed yourself? You're a growing kid.
Yeah. I mean, I was fortunate. The Louisiana school system at least when I was a kid, we still had pretty good lunches, you know, like hot lunch was something I looked forward to. I've always been a very food-oriented and motivated person, but coming home from school, you know, like any good 10-year-old boy, I was always, you know, looking for snacks. And my father's kind of a product of Depression-era Arkansas, so very much into fishing, hunting, and not doing it as a recreational pursuit, but as a way to put food on the table kind of thing. And so our freezers were full of things like, you know, ground venison and packages of fish fillets and packages of shrimp. And, you know, unbeknownst to me at the time, because I didn't know anything different, but like, you know, Louisiana is the sportsman's paradise for a reason. There's exceptional wild game and you know, wild food opportunities down there. And so, you know, as a young kid, I kind of was like, well, I'm not gonna have something I can just pop in the microwave. I'm gonna cook something here. And you know, I made quite a mess in the kitchen for
I can picture your mom coming home after her nursing shift and finding thawed out alligator meat or venison meat and playing around in the kitchen. So that was sort of your early brush with food, but like how did you actually get into, like how did you realize, okay, food's going to be my thing, I'm going to move into culinary? At what age did you kind of sense that was your journey?
So, you know, as a young person, I became aware of people, you know, like Emeril Lagasse was in his very early days as I was a kid. And Paul Prudhomme is an amazing Louisiana chef who, Justin Wilson is another one that kind of predates both of them before cooking was cool and it was just a PBS thing. And, you know, Justin Wilson was a kind of a regular fixture, you know, on television around our house. All of those things were interesting to me. I loved food. I didn't necessarily love math or English, right? So as I went into high school, I actually opted for a route that allowed me to take what was called ProStart. And ProStart was culinary training that you could do as a high school student that actually allowed me in my junior and senior year to go to Louisiana Technical College in New Orleans and earn a culinary certificate. So at a fairly early age, I kind of decided that was the path that I wanted to go academically, and I felt like it would lead to a good career professionally. In kind of lockstep with that, I started working in restaurants as a young kid. I actually lied to my local Chinese restaurant and told them I was 15 because you needed to be 15 at the time to work. I was only 14. But they weren't checking IDs, and so I got a job at my local Chinese restaurant, washing dishes and working as a prep cook, which was my first introduction to kitchens. And honestly, it was a lot of fun. You know, I got there right after school. There was an absolute mountain of dishes from the lunch shift. By right around dinner time, I had the mountain worked down to you know, a pretty clean dish bit, and then I got to eat like an all-I-could-eat. They called it the busboy dinner, you know, and it was just this mountainous plate. Fried rice and egg rolls and stuff, and I was like, this is great. You know, not to mention I was making, you know, $4.15 an hour, right? But yeah, and then we would get into the dinner shift, and it was kind of rock and roll. You know, the cooks were tough and kind of seedy, and you know, the front of house was all really sweet people, and it was just this fun dynamic. I felt like I had a second family in the hospitality world, and that's been a continuous theme kind of throughout my career in hospitality, is that it really is like a community. But yeah, I moved on from there in kind of an upward trajectory throughout restaurants in the New Orleans area. I made a move over to a Thai restaurant with one of the waitresses from the Chinese restaurant, and that was a great move, honestly, because the Thai restaurant was much more serious about cooking. It was an entire family had come over from Thailand, and they were doing, you know, really kind of what would be innovative food at the time for like the Metro New Orleans area. You know, it's mostly all Cajun food down there, and
galangal and things that you probably never heard of, kaffir lime leaves and things, right?
And I got the really exciting privilege of eating family meal with them, right? And so anybody who's worked in the industry knows that, like, you know, the kitchen staff and the front of house, like, they come together for a meal usually each shift. And getting to sit down with that literal family of employees there and eat dinner with them was such an experience. You know, I got to experience things like crawfish and blue crab and, you know, Louisiana redfish prepared with Thai influences, right? So it was really neat to go beyond the Penang curry and the, you know, pad krapao and the kind of classic Thai dishes that you still see on menus today. and get to try things where they were kind of freestyling, right? With
family
their
meal
training.
is the best.
It is.
Because it's never on the menu.
Oh, totally.
So you get to eat what they get to eat at home. Okay, so tell us about the CIA. You had like this dream to go into the CIA, and what happened instead?
Yeah, I did. As a product of the ProStart system, right, I graduated with that certificate, and I kind of realized that that wasn't enough for me in terms of education, right? I wanted to continue this journey of learning. I didn't want to just stay in New Orleans and stay working with the same community of people. You know, my peer group was going off to exciting experiences elsewhere, and I had a connection with a CIA-trained chef who worked at the Marriott in New Orleans on Canal Street. And he said, hey, we have this recruitment event coming up. You should come down and meet some of the admissions people. You know, I think you'd be really impressed. And I went down and I was really impressed. It was awesome. But the you know, financial requirements were just out of this world.
What was it then? Probably like
it was going to cost me something like $60,000 or $70,000
back then.
Yeah, to get my degree. And
Wow.
you know, I could go to Southeast Louisiana University or even LSU for, you know, like $8,000 or $9,000, you know, in tuition. So it was just something that, you know, as the fourth kid in a relatively frugal military family, that was like, it wasn't happening, right? So
what happened instead? You went back, you talked to your dad, and what did dad say?
Yeah, so a little bit of context there I think is important in that when my dad left the military, he became a JROTC instructor. So he worked at a high school in the area. And as a JROTC instructor, they're kind of like a feeder pipeline to the recruiters to send people into the military. Because in all honesty, if you're going to join the military, attending JROTC in high school is a great way to get a leg up because you'll go in at a higher pay grade, you'll go in with a lot more understanding of what military decorum is like. So anyways, my dad had this whole relationship. He actually kind of pushed me in the direction of the Navy, mostly because the Navy was the option that had the most transferable career skills from being a culinary arts person in the military to being a culinary arts person in the civilian world. Wow. And there were also some really exciting opportunities within the Navy, which I'm sure we'll get to. So
yeah. So I want to grab that clicker from you real quick. So this is Rob, and I think like you'd really enjoy seeing Rob in his short shorts there. This is young Rob, conquering the world, and you're standing on top of what there in the Navy? Yeah, so that is submarine?
Yeah, it is. So
cool.
I did. I joined the Navy. I ended up on a nuclear submarine out of Norfolk, Virginia. Yeah. It was a fast attack sub SSN 723, the USS Oklahoma City. A sad day, she was recently decommissioned, so I'm truly getting old. But back then, actually in that picture, I'm standing there with Matthew Akers and my friend Michael, and we are in Suda Bay, Crete. So we're in the middle of the Mediterranean Ocean. You can actually maybe make out a little French submarine in the background there. And it was quite an exciting time in life.
I've actually never met anybody or talked to anybody that actually worked inside a submarine. So tell us, what is it like being in a submarine and then cooking for people in a submarine?
Absolutely.
For like what, 5 years?
For 5 years, I was on that sub.
Amazing.
So a sub is a really unique environment. It's kind of like being on an airplane, but like never being able to leave, right? Right. The sub has about 125 to 140 people, depending on what we're doing. And it's, it's all men, at least on Los Angeles class fast attacks. It has changed in recent years where some of the new Virginia class submarines have a new kind of berthing and bathroom facilities to allow for women to be on the submarine as well. But on the fast attacks, they were kind of built before that was a consideration. So they've never been integrated. But either way, bunch of young guys stuck in a steel tube, cruising under the ocean. Submarines are remarkable. They are nuclear powered. So you learn a lot about nuclear radiation and about how to protect yourself from that and monitor that. You wear this little TLD device that tracks the amount of radiation you receive. So I can actually catch radio waves right now. No, I'm just kidding.
That's so cool. How do you feed like 145 people 3 times a day on a submarine?
Yeah.
Like where do you even start with prep and dishes and
Yeah.
And plating, how does that happen?
Honestly, the hardest part is storing all the food.
Yeah.
So the way that the submarine menu worked is we would use what's called a cycle menu. And so the cycle menu was something where we determined that over a 6-week span of time, for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then we actually fed a 4th meal at midnight called mid-rats. So we fed a meal every 6 hours on a submarine. So it wasn't just the standard kind of 3 meals a day, because everybody can't just go to sleep at night and the boat run itself, right? We have a full crew that's running everything, and we have to feed them in between shifts. So 4 meals a day, operating 24 hours a day, basically. The interesting thing about nuclear subs is they really have nothing that limits the amount of time they can spend at sea other than food. Right, so figuring out how much food we could store really determined the amount of time we could operate, and that was an interesting experience as a young person. I actually placed an order for $188,000 worth of food as I think I was 20 years old when I was on the submarine. So I was like, I'm about to hit enter on this, Chief. This is $188,000. He's like, hit enter, and I sent it off to our prime
tax dollars at work.
I'm telling you.
How long did that food last you for?
That lasted us for 87 days straight. So we fed about 140 people for 87 days continuously. And that food, this was ahead of one of our bigger deployments that we went on. We were actually sleeping with that food, walking on that food. Our freezer was packed from the floor to ceiling, from wall to wall. So it wasn't like you walked in and looked along the aisle at what you were going to pick out. You actually had to swim over the frozen prime ribs to get back to the pork loins and fish them out to prepare for a meal. It was an experience.
Amazing. Yeah. You need to write a memoir about this kind of stuff. The sad thing about this is I tried so hard to get photos of this for you guys, but there were no cell phones then. And of course, Rob was in a submarine, so we don't have any footage of it. Yeah. But it's all in your head, so you need to get it on paper.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did you go from that to this?
Yeah, so
in the White House. And that's Lindsay, your beautiful bride of almost 8 some years.
Yeah, coming up on 10 years.
10 years,
Yeah. I think if we reference back to my formative years in Louisiana, I actually had quite a bit of culinary education entering into the military to cook. The way the military entrance exam works is you take what's called the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. Based on your score on that, it'll determine what opportunities are available to you in the military. A lot of folks who don't do terribly well in the ASVAB end up choosing to be a cook or a military policeman or a rifleman. They don't necessarily choose to cook in the military because they love cooking, right? I was somewhat of an odd entity in that I loved cooking, I had training in cooking, and I wanted to cook in the military, so I chose that job. On the submarine, I was able to really kind of stand out. The picture that you showed of me on the submarine is somewhat indicative of the kind of special journey that I had in that beyond my primary duty as a cook, I actually got to go to dive school in Hawaii and become a Navy diver, which is why I was in those short shorts on top of the submarine, because I was the person that would dive into the water and rescue someone if they fell overboard. I also did, scuba inspections of the submarine. I even had to go in the ocean and, work on the submarine and do preventative maintenance and things like that as a diver too. So all of those things, in addition to my love of cooking and my love of kind of hospitality and feeding people on the sub, allowed me to get really high evaluations. I won some recognition as a junior sailor of the year and things like that. Because of those things, I got an opportunity to talk to folks at the Navy Food Management team, and they recommended I interview for a position with Presidential Food Service. Presidential Food Service is a kind of an elite Navy unit that feeds the first family and operates out of the West Wing at the White House. And so from that interview until me actually realizing that opportunity was almost a year of background investigations. It's pretty intense to actually get selected for that, because you have a higher security clearance than people that work at the Pentagon.
Yeah, you're feeding the president. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. You are within the distance of me and you from the president and the first family. So they go well beyond a background investigation, and they go into ethics and morality and these really intense investigations into your history. I had to sit in a what's called a skiff room. So it's a secret classified room, so no windows, padded walls, and the guy that was interviewing me looked like Agent Anderson from The Matrix. He had the buzz cut and the glasses, and he's asking me all these questions about all sorts of embarrassing and uncomfortable topics to kind of determine how I'm going to respond and whether or not I'm being truthful. And it was intense. I left that with, twice my normal blood pressure, I think, from the stress of it. But I made it through. I was indeed a good kid growing up, and I got the opportunity to serve at the White House. Yeah,
so tell us a little bit about that, because when I first heard about this, I was like, oh, wow, you're cooking for Obama. But you weren't really cooking just for Obama. You were, tell us how it all works out in the West Wing.
Absolutely. So Presidential Food Service is a group of about 40 Navy cooks. We did, in the last 10 years or so, allow for one member of the other armed force branches to serve with us. So we had one Coastie, one Army guy, one Marine, and so on. But either way, it's essentially Navy guys, because Navy guys are the best cooks in the military, and girls, I should say. So we operated out of the West Wing. We have what's called the White House Navy Mess there. And in the West Wing, we operated a kitchen that fed the president and the next about 600 people within the administration that are kind of the upper crust, right? We didn't feed everybody. There was the Eisenhower Executive Office building across the street, or the EEOB, and that had a GSA cafeteria. So if you were really kind of a level of, I don't know the most appropriate way to say this, but if you weren't a big dog in the administration, you ate at the GSA cafeteria, right? But if you were a big deal, you got to eat at the White House Navy Mess, and based on your level of rank in the administration, you had different degrees of privilege. So like the president had 2 Navy guys that worked directly adjacent to his office, and all of his meals were prepared in the kitchen and then brought up and served in the Oval Office for him. And so he would have private luncheons in there. Same thing for the Chief of Staff and the NSA. They were the folks that had that in-office dining room privileges. And then the remainder of the administration had the opportunity to dine in one of our 3 dining rooms. And so we would do breakfast, lunch, and then kind of a light dinner service. For the most part, we fed the president lunch every day.
And what was his go-to? What did he like? Was he a sandwich guy, a sub guy, or a burger?
The president was a healthy guy. This is President Obama, obviously. He was very thoughtful about what he ate. He ate a lot of whole grains, so things like brown rice, barleys. He enjoyed eating lean proteins, chicken, salmon, things like that. Occasionally we would do red meat or steak. And so for the most part, his meals were pretty healthy and thoughtful, and also had some degree of a seasonal influence, right? We would try to cook things that were available from the Metro D.C. area and that were seasonally appropriate. But as an eater, he enjoyed spices, he enjoyed textures, he enjoyed flavors, and so it was a very exciting person to cook for. We weren't serving Mickey D's, right?
I think that Thai restaurant came in handy for
you.
you.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was a lot of good preparation for that job, and in addition to cooking for the family there at the White House, we also got to travel, and that was a really neat experience because during my time in the Navy, I got to see 26 countries. I got to visit something like 35 states. And that was all in support of official presidential travel. And so, I found myself in places like Bangkok, Thailand, and the Presidential Palace, working with their food service team, getting to, feed the president and, the Thai Prime Minister. It looked really exciting.
But you also had one very special thing you got to do, which you'll take away with you for a very long time. And what was that?
So one of the trips that I got to go on with was to South America. And while we were in South America, my particular stop was in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. In Rio, the president was staying at the JW Marriott, which, Rio has Copacabana Beach, which is incredibly iconic and well known, and the harbor there is truly beautiful. There are these gorgeous little mountains at either end of it. There's the Corcovado, which is the big statue of Christ kind of overlooking Copacabana Beach. And at about 9:30 at night, the president finally got done with his schedule, and he's having dinner with his family on the rooftop of the Marriott. I was on duty that evening to take care of them and kind of serve the food, make the drinks, and so on. It's a hot, muggy evening. The waves are crashing on the beach. There's a beautiful starry sky. You could still see the mountains from the moonlight. And the president was in a great mood, having a good time with his family, and he was having a couple of drinks. And his drink of choice was a vodka martini. And the way we were trained to make his vodka martinis was to, do a little bit of dry vermouth, dump it out, put the ice and the vodka in there, and shake, shake, shake until it got where when you poured it, there would be this beautiful kind of little icy flotilla on top of the martini. And I just shook the heck out of it until my hand was frozen. I poured it, I gave it to him, and he reached back and just slapped me on the back as he, took a sip of it, because it was like, I think, for him it was like finally the end of the day, he's relaxing, he's with his family, and he's the freaking president of the United States, like how cool is that? And so
Awesome.
it was neat. I'll always remember that, I think.
Yeah, so you had that perfect little layer of ice on top.
Yeah.
I'll shake it and pour it.
Yeah,
Good
not
job.
like James Bond, right?
Good job. So you made the president a martini. That's the best thing ever.
Yeah.
So tell us about, how did you kind of move out of the White House, and how did you find yourself in Maine?
Yeah.
Curious about your journey here. What brought you to us?
So my time at the White House was always kind of on a time schedule, right? Like everything in the military is a duty assignment, and it has a start and an end date that going into it. I knew that my time at the White House was scheduled to end in March of 2013, but I wanted to explore staying in the Navy. So I talked to some of my senior leadership there about that. I talked to the detailers. I was doing well. I was up for board to make chief, and what I didn't want to do, though, was go back to a submarine. And unfortunately, because the submarine community was so undermanned in the E7 rating for culinary specialists, there was really no way they could keep me from having to go back to a submarine. They offered me the opportunity to extend, but I would have had to re-enlist to include a subtour, and I just kind of said
5
no.
years is a lot of time in a submarine.
Yeah. And my life had changed. I had met my wife, I had, a dog, and I had other aspirations beyond going back and being trapped in a steel tube, because there's some hardships to being on a submarine. Like when you're underway, you have no communication whatsoever with the outside world. No emails, no phone, nothing. You're completely cut off. And the longest period of time that we did that was 80 days straight, So imagine not talking to your spouse for 80 straight days, or seeing your family or hearing from them for that long. And I don't know, I felt like that was cool when I was young and single, but as an adult, I didn't want to go back and do that. And in addition to that part of it, I also didn't want to go back to cooking food that came out of cans and that was, dehydrated and shelf stable. I got, really pretty spoiled at the White House, working with exceptional ingredients, getting to go out in the garden and pick fresh vegetables. And I think, it bears mentioning that, Michelle Obama had a big influence on the direction of food within the White House. Part of her initiative was around getting people to think about growing their own food again, cooking seasonally again. I got to experience quite a few trips out to the White House garden and the exceptional, kind of vegetables they were growing there. I wanted to keep doing that. I didn't want to go back to that kind of institutional food service. So in light of the fact I had to go back to a sub, I opted to part ways with the military, and I ended up making my way to Vermont. In Vermont, I got the opportunity to become the fellow at the New England Culinary Institute in Montpelier. Vermont was appealing, one, because it's a really incredible local food system, but two, it was also back to New England where my wife was from, and it kind of just made sense for our lives. And NECI was a school that I felt like had a good reputation, produced good quality, cooks that entered into the world ready to kick butt and, take names. And NECI was a good experience. I ended up completing my bachelor's while I was working there, got really immersed into Vermont's food system, learned a ton of interesting things about agriculture and about food. Ultimately wanted to start experiencing more of that firsthand. And that's what led us to Maine, actually. Vermont was somewhat cost prohibitive in terms of access to land and also economic kind of opportunity. The New England Culinary Institute changed ownership while I was there, and I ended up kind of leaving because I didn't want to stay on board for the kind of future of it. Coming to Maine gave me the opportunity to enter into a broader economy where there was more opportunity. And also we bought some really interesting property and started a really cool homestead, which has been a fun journey and kind of part
yeah.
of
and here you are today
pile
with
of
all of this.
veggies, yeah.
So you landed at University of Maine. So tell us about this amazing sort of Willy Wonka factory behind you here.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
So I should mention there was one stop before UMaine. When I first came to Maine, I actually ended up as the director of food service for an energy company in Hamden, Maine, where I ran a deli chain, and that was an interesting experience because it kind of took me from being a chef or an educator and more into being kind of an overall business manager, and really paying attention to financials and building vendor relationships, which was an interesting transition. Not one that I loved through and through, but it was an important part of my kind of growth as a professional in hospitality. So it is worth mentioning. But I did ultimately pursue this opportunity at UMaine to join the School of Food and Agriculture and to take over the Dr. Matthew Hyland's pilot plant.
So what is it? Tell us what the plant's all about.
Yeah, so my position at UMaine is a split appointment between the School of Food and Agriculture and the Office of Innovation and Economic Development. So the Dr. Matthew Hyland's pilot plant is a food processing pilot plant. What that means is we do research into product development, into process development, and into process refinement. And so, and all of that is in the context of food. So in my role with the School of Food and Ag, I work with the research cluster of the School of Food and Ag as well as Cooperative Extension. And we do research into food where we explore things like turning invasive green crabs into an edible food product, like actually what we've been working on is a Vietnamese fish sauce, but made from invasive green crabs, which is really interesting but very smelly. We've also done things like working with Good Shepherd Food Bank on developing a processing line for individually quick froze broccoli. All right, so IQF broccoli is something that can be grown here in Maine, but processing infrastructure didn't exist for. And we were able to partner with Matt Chin and the Harvesting Good Initiative to help kind of do some yield estimates on different varieties of broccoli and develop a whole processing parameter for that. So
is this broccoli grown in Maine?
It is,
okay.
Yeah. And the exciting thing is this will give us the opportunity to eat broccoli grown in Maine year-round rather than just during the fall season when it's available. It seems like a really insignificant thing, but that vegetable processing line is going to create a lot of food security here in Maine and a lot of economic opportunities for farmers here in Maine to grow more broccoli rather than an unsellable cover crop.
So this was interesting to me that Rob had mentioned that it's actually a blueberry processing plant.
It is.
But it's only used, 3 months of the year?
Yeah.
So then it just sits vacant.
Yeah.
And so now the broccoli will be processed there for the
Indeed.
rest of the year. And so it's actually interesting that you're able to use that year-round.
Yeah, so so all the credit really goes to Matt Chen. He's the executive vice president at the Good Shepherd Food Bank, but he's also the president of Harvesting Good. So Harvesting Good was an initiative he started as he received funding from the Kendall Foundation's Food Vision Prize. And what Matt's vision was to work with farms in Aroostook County to grow broccoli and then develop a processing facility that he actually built as an addendum onto what used to be Allen's in Orland, but is now Wyman's. And the genius of that is that he could share their freezing tunnel. And as you mentioned, the blueberry freezing tunnel was only in use during the wild blueberry season.
Right.
Conveniently, broccoli is harvested post the wild blueberry season. So they were able to keep the plant open for an additional period of time to process the broccoli. But what was really important about that was that it shared the capital expense of the processing facility, right? It allowed them to just build the floretting and blanching line and utilize the existing infrastructure that was in place to do the freezing. So a very thrifty approach to it.
Yeah.
And we were just thrilled to be a part of that initiative because in addition to creating a saleable product through Hannaford's, it's also going to be something that's distributed to pantries statewide. So people here in Maine will get a chance to eat nutritious, broccoli grown here in Maine too, which is really exciting.
That is really exciting.
Yeah.
So when you think of, the pilot plant and the opportunities you have there standing next to you is a really smart and an incredible human and a very brilliant person, Dr. Beth Calder. And I love Beth because she actually introduced me to you, but Beth helped me with bringing my product to market. And she's a food scientist, and she is waiting for you to give her call.
Yeah.
So call her because she has had the most patience with me. I've asked her over 900 questions, and I asked her the same 900 questions 3 months later, and 3 months later again, and she acted like she'd never told me them before and was very patient with me. But I've written about her on my blog. She's amazing, and I went up to visit. This was actually a very special day in my life when I came up to give you guys my first jar of macaroni that I had produced in my kitchen shelf stable, and you took it home.
I did.
I remember that.
Absolutely delicious.
You were brave.
Yeah.
And Beth was the one who actually helped me bring it to market. So she tests it and makes sure that it's food safe, that I'm actually doing the right thing and feeding people and not killing them. So that's Beth's job. She's really good at that.
Yes.
But anyway, so I came up to visit and I met with Rob and I actually walked around. I have some really fun videos that are on my blog, but essentially of you talking about all the different things that are set up in the pilot plant. And at that point you were talking about lobsters and what you do with the shells, and you have a freeze blaster in the back. And so it's really some interesting high-tech equipment that kind of went over my head, but I'm sure when you're working on these projects with clients, so you work with Wyman's, who are some of the other clients? I know some of it is confidential, but...
Yeah, so that's kind of, as I mentioned, it's both the School of Food and Ag and the Office of Innovation and Economic Development. So through that OIED, or Office of Innovation and Economic Development lens, I work to leverage the facility to serve industry here in Maine, right? So the University of Maine is a land grant university, which means that we have a mission to serve our community and serve our local economy. And so in that capacity, I run a service center, right? So the pilot plant has all of this interesting equipment that kind of came either as a product of research, where the steamer actually that Beth and I are leaning against there was part of a research project that Dr. Bolton entered into with the lobster industry to develop steaming infrastructure for conveyor steaming for lobsters. He did a thermal validation study. But either way, that equipment is then useful to other people, right? So it's my job to kind of leverage the facility and leverage that equipment to support businesses. So as you mentioned, I've been successful in doing that with a lot of Maine brands. So Wyman's has been one of our best partners. They're an incredible company here in Maine, been here for, I believe, 4 generations, and they employ a lot of people here in Maine. We have been working with them to broaden their product portfolio. Right now, I imagine everyone is thinking Wyman's wild blueberries, right?
Right.
See them at every Hannaford, every Walmart in the country. You can buy Maine wild blueberries frozen in a bag. Wyman sees an opportunity to grow as a company by expanding into consumer packaged goods, right? So things that you might eat for breakfast or that you might eat for dessert.
Like what? What would that be?
Things like having maybe a yogurt parfait that you can hold in your hand and eat like a sandwich, right? So pretty innovative and creative stuff. I can't get into too many details on it because I might get in trouble with Pat, but there are some very exciting new products that we've been able to fill the void in Wyman's team, where they have a bunch of people who are great at marketing fruit, at selling fruit, at processing fruit, but they don't have anyone on their team that does R&D and food development. So we have been able to be a kind of add-on to their team and do some of that R&D and some of that product development for them, which in turn has been wonderful for UMaine because it provides academic opportunities for students, and it also provides funding to keep our facility alive and vibrant and allow us to do additional programming. In addition to Wyman's, we've worked with folks like Maine Grains, Bristol Seafood, Pimlico Mussel and Oyster Company, and we've gotten to work on some really innovative new things like aquaculture grown scallops. We did a research project with the Aquaculture Research Institute where we explored canning those as a Spanish-style conservas product, which was really exciting and kind of bridging the gap between academic work and service work. But yeah, there's a lot of neat things happening
Okay, so you've got me really peaked. So what is this now about canning scallops, not mussels?
Yeah, so in something that's really new and innovative in the aquaculture realm here in Maine is growing scallops in a farm setting, right? So traditionally, scallops have been something that have been a wild fishery. Unlike other bivalves, scallops actually swim around, right? Like an oyster or a mussel will pretty much tether itself to something and spend its entire life in one spot, whereas a scallop has the ability to actually swim. So because of scallops' ability to swim, when they're harvested wild, they are typically shucked on board the vessel, and they remove every part of the scallop except for the adductor muscle, right? And the reason they do that is because of the potential for that scallop to have been in an area where there was toxic algae, right? So it could have some degree of toxicity as a wild product. So they cut away everything except for that one little, I like to call it a marshmallow of meat, right? And what you're actually throwing away is like 70% of that organism, and all of it is edible, right? So the folks that have borrowed from some Japanese traditions of raising scallops here in Maine have done so through the kind of experimental nature of the Darling Marine Center and Dana Morse, as well as folks from CEI, which is Coastal Enterprises Incorporated, have provided some funding. And we've got some really cool people like Vertical Bay Scallops down in the Belfast area, and Pin Bay Scallops, which is my dear friend Marston Brewer in Stonington. So what Megan Dwyer, who is the co-chair or co-director of the Aquaculture Research Institute, and I saw was an opportunity to do some value-added product development with these scallops. It allows them to fetch a little bit higher market price, and it also allows something that has a relatively short life to have a shelf-stable kind of market presence, right? So Megan is a product of having worked in some very nice restaurants and keeps her finger on the pulse of hospitality and fine dining, and in recent years, tinned seafood has really exploded. So people are going to restaurants and spending a lot of money to have an imported tin of fish opened at their table with a bottle of wine and some bread, and they just eat that. We saw an opportunity to take what is Maine's most novel and exciting new aquaculture product and prepare it in the same fashion. Which is very tricky, actually. Low acid canning is challenging. You have to hit certain temperature thresholds to prevent the potential for Clostridium botulinum or botulism. So the thermal processing for that actually has to be done by a process authority, and people who have that degree of specialization are few and far in between. Right. Here in Maine, we only have one working cannery left. Where we used to be a pretty vibrant place for canning. The only one left is AM Look and Whiting, which is Bar Harbor Foods. And so we actually had to go to the University of Michigan, of all places. And we were flying scallops halfway across the continent to have them, do the thermal processing on it and then flying them back. And it was a really interesting product. But we ended up with some delicious canned scallops, honestly.
So let me ask you this. So I'm sure everyone else is thinking, so does it end up being just the marshmallow part of the scallop, or was it? So how are you going to educate folks to start eating the whole scallop? Because I've never seen the whole scallop, and I know we're going to see a photo of that later, but I don't know if I want to eat the rest of that 70%. I want the 30% because I've been trained to eat that. And so you're going to have to do a whole bunch of work or education around that and demos.
Yes, and that is very much a real element to that. It is a little intimidating to eat the rest of it, right? Because you're so unfamiliar with it. But if you're a person who likes oysters or who likes mussels, it's not that hard to get on board with eating the whole scallop. I serve on the steering committee at the Alliance for Maine's Marine Economy, which is a group that was able to aggregate a bunch of state funding to promote innovation within Maine's seafood sector. I did a summer cooking tour with them year before last, and as part of that I became good friends with Marston, and I got to spend a day with Marston at the pilot plant where he brought several different year classes of the scallops that he had been raising, either using lantern nets or ear hanging, and I was a little bit like, I've never eaten this, this is a little intimidating. I will admit I liked the younger scallops better than the older scallops, like they get pretty darn big, right? And so the littler ones, Marsden does this recipe called Pen Bay popcorn. And so he takes these scallops that are, maybe 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. He puts them in a pot with a little bit of butter and water and steams them until they pop open, and the scallops let out their juices, and it marries with that buttery, steamy water, and they are absolutely addictive. I mean, I probably ate, no kidding, like $140 worth of scallops that afternoon, just like no shame, like a pig eating scallops.
So this is with the mussels and everything attached to it?
Everything, yeah. Just the scallop goes in whole, it pops open, and you just kind of shuck and eat the little delicious scallops. They do have and this may be getting too technical, but they do have a little, it's where they accumulate the plankton and things like that they're eating, so they call it their gut sac. Typically, when you eat it, you kind of, leave that part behind on the shell and eat the rest of it, but that's maybe too much.
Yeah.
You know, but they're very good.
That's so yum.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you think about Maine food, right, the whole food culture, like what are the most iconic Maine foods for you? And then tell us about this really fascinating tour that you took, what is it, 12 very lucky chefs on?
Yeah.
I want to sit on this bus. I've already booked it for 2024. I will write a grant myself so I can sit on this bus because it was very, very cool. And what I did today as a special treat for all of us is that I asked for permission to get photos of somebody who was on the bus and took them. And I'm going to have Rob actually switch seats with me and just walk us through this whole tour that he took everyone on for 4 days, and it's just so delicious and it's so informative. So tell us about what do you think the iconic Maine foods are? And
So I should preface that by saying, like, I'm so lucky to be here in Maine doing this job. There's probably nowhere else in the country where this job would be as interesting as it is here in Maine. We have an unbelievably interesting food system. You know, we've got incredible land-based agriculture, but we've also got so many miles of clean, cold water on our coastline with important, iconic fisheries as well as innovative, new aquaculture. So really cool place. In terms of, what is Maine food? I think that's an ever-changing answer, but you would be remiss not to mention things like wild blueberries, lobsters, potatoes, apples, grains. We've got incredible dairy. There's so much to Maine's food system. I could take up the rest of the hour just mentioning them, but let's dive into.
Like 20 minutes. So.
Well, let's dive into PDAL.
What does PDAL stand for?
Yeah. So again, context is important on this because I've got to give credit where credit is due. I joined the university in 2019. I joined as part of SFA and OIED. One of the other elements of the university that's really important is cooperative extension. So some folks have maybe already understand what cooperative extension is, but they are the unit at UMaine that is entirely outward focused, right? They don't do academics, they don't do teaching, they just do service and they support their communities in so many different capacities, right? Everything from agriculture to how to can food safely, right? One of the wonderful people that works for Extension is Kathy Savoy. Kathy Savoy works out of our Falmouth office, and she saw the opportunity to engage with our career tech ed programs back in the like 2015, 2014. And Kathy actually started doing some baseline assessments around this concept of ag literacy for our career tech ed culinary arts programs. So career tech ed are high school programs. There are 21 of them around the state, and they are where our young people go to learn trade skills. Kathy thought there was a great opportunity to focus on our local food system within that curriculum, and I was able to jump on board with a grant with Kathy in 2019 where we applied to the USDA together for the Professional Development and Ag Literacy Grant. We were awarded $300,000 over 3 years to spend time with our community, our CTE community, helping promote the usage of local ag and more of their curriculum. And one of the elements of that program is this 4-day summer institute. And I got to have kind of a guiding hand in shaping this trip. So I'm particularly excited to share the journey that we went on. But picture behind us
I'm going to pass you that. You take us through it. So where's Kathy in the photo?
So Kathy is the person in the white shirt that is, it's kind of hard to orient myself here. I have to look at the screen. She's to my right, or to my left on the screen by one there. So Kathy gets a lot of credit for this overall initiative, but I'm excited to be part of it. We also have another project participant, Willie Grenier from Maine Ag in the Classroom, who is a big part of this grant as well. But the rest of the people in the photo are some of our state's career tech ed culinary arts instructors. So they're from around the state, and we took them on a really fun tour of Maine's food system. And our tour started out at Wyman's in DeBlois. So it was a really neat way to begin the tour because it was very immersive, right? We drove out into a field where everywhere as far as the eyes could see were plump, fat, round, delicious blueberries, just surrounded with them. End of July was an exceptional time to go visit a blueberry barren. And it was so cool. And we toured the barrens. We learned from Bruce Bruce Hall and Colleen Walker from Wyman's about the history of blueberries, about how they're grown, how they're harvested, and while blueberries are an amazing fruit, I won't go into too much detail into the history of them, but we should be really proud to have this as part of our food system here in Maine. We also got the opportunity to have lunch while we were at Wyman's, and Wyman's has for many years brought folks up from Mexico to work in their fields and to work harvesting their crops. And they've built this whole kind of migrant community there, and Deblois, to support them, out of that has actually grown several really interesting Mexican restaurants throughout down East Maine. So, you're in the middle of nowhere, Maine, and all of a sudden there's this Vasquez family restaurant, which is serving legit, like Mexican food, really traditional, really delicious. You go in the kitchen and it's all the abuelitas, and they're cooking and making tortillas from hand. And I think that's a neat thing where it's kind of this intersection of agriculture and, culture or society, where it's cool that Wyman's has kind of brought that to Washington County.
When you were on the podcast with me, you told me about a soccer match.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that right?
I think they do have a soccer field there.
They have a soccer match there.
They do. And it's just this really neat thing that kind of gets to be part of the fabric of who we are here in Maine.
Awesome.
And it was cool to begin the tour both with an experience in the Blueberry Barrens, but also with that kind of cultural experience of enjoying Vasquez family takeout for lunch there at the field where it actually began, right? Where those people first came to Maine, over, I think, 3 decades ago. So that was cool and a cool way to start. But from there, we actually got to take a lot of Wyman's products with us. And one of the neat things is because we were a traveling band of chefs, we cooked all of our own meals. And so everywhere we went along our tour, we collected ingredients, and the chefs were challenged in these kind of, similar to like Chopped or Iron Chef, in these culinary challenges where they had to take what they had learned that day and apply it to the meals that we were going to share and eat as a group, which was great for building fellowship between the instructors, but also really cool because I got to have all these, great, talented people cook dinner for me every night, so it worked out great. But
now does that look like real white blueberry powder, or is it blueberries?
That actually is blueberry powder. So we took fresh blueberries, we took blueberry powder, and we took blueberry juice with us from Wyman's. So Wyman's actually has an e-commerce store where they sell some of their other blueberry products beyond the frozen fruit, and that's one of the things that's available in there now. But we used it to make a croissant bread pudding that was really delicious. We used it for whipped cream that we topped some other desserts with, and it was tasty. It's a neat product and has a lot of application beyond just getting
like value added.
Dumped in a smoothie. So on our way from Wyman's, as we headed kind of towards the coast, we stopped in Machiasport to visit Cook Aquaculture. So Cook Aquaculture is actually one of the largest aquaculture farms in the world, and they raise salmon here in Maine. And it's salmon farming is important because it feeds a lot of people, and a lot of people love eating salmon, right? So there is some contention around the impact of salmon farming, and there's some contention around the feed conversion ratios and how much protein it takes to feed salmon. But it's indisputable that people love to eat it and that people will buy it, and that Cook is doing a lot of work to raise and produce these salmon in the best possible way, right? They're working hard to do that. We visited their processing facility. In their processing facility that day, they were preparing an order for Hannaford, and they were cutting, their quota for that day was to cut 45,000 pounds of fillets. Incredible.
In one day?
In one day.
Or one shift?
Yeah, and that, I believe that was their daily goal. Wow. And so they had a line of about 8 people working on a pretty automated salmon processing line. Cutting. And that was really neat to see. And we did leave with some fillets right off the line, which those fish were swimming hours before, which is you're so lucky. We are so lucky here in Maine to have a fresh fish supply like that, where you can even go to your local Hannaford and you can buy fish that was swimming 2 days ago, because it came from right there in Machias, which is, really exciting. And most seafood is coming to us frozen, whereas this salmon has never been frozen.
So how do we look for it in Hannaford? Is it the only salmon they carry there? So we shouldn't even.
Well, I believe most Hannafords have a wild salmon option as well as a farm salmon. Typically, the farm salmon will say raised in Maine, and that's the Cook Aquaculture salmon, and it's really great stuff. I buy it regularly. Whenever it goes on sale, I buy a whole lot of it and freeze it because it's nice. it hasn't been previously frozen. You know, a lot of the
Right.
seafood that you look at the counter there has a little, you know, in the little corner of its description it says previously frozen, because a lot of the fish is caught and processed at sea and
Right.
frozen at sea. And you know, there's a lot of good product like that, but you wouldn't want to go home and then refreeze that, right?
Right.
Whereas this is truly, truly fresh stuff. And this was also an important part of our tour earlier in the PDAL program, where we went and visited the CTE programs and cooked with their students. For a lot of young people throughout Maine had never eaten salmon, and the acceptability was through the roof. Almost all the kids were really thrilled to have tasted it and gotten to cook with it, and they chose it over all the other options that we had. They were all very enticed by the salmon. So it's a neat product, and I have nothing but good things to say about the people at Cook.
Yeah, and we're supporting local fishermen.
Yeah,
So that's great.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so our next stop was to visit Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. Maine Coast Sea Vegetables is right in Ellsworth, Maine, and they're a remarkable company that I think gets lost sometimes in the conversation around seaweed innovation here in Maine. Maine Coast Sea Veg just celebrated, I believe, their 50th anniversary. So they've been doing this since before seaweed was cool, and they are doing it in a broader, more holistic manner than some of the simply kelp-focused farms that you're hearing a lot about today. Maine Coast Sea Veg sells a lot of wild harvested seaweeds, not farmed seaweeds. And there's an incredible diversity of them throughout the Gulf of Maine and the North Atlantic. They've got a wonderful person working for them named Cherie Scott, who's a dear friend of mine. She's just, in addition to being the most amazing seaweed ambassador, she's a truly wonderful person. And standing behind her in the green shirt is Serafina Earhart, and Serafina is the second generation, owner or CEO of Maine
Right, 'cause
Coast
it's
Sea
been around
Vegetables.
for 50 years.
Yeah,
Wow.
it was her father that started it. There's actually a really neat picture in their lobby of her in like a baby pack basket while her parents are wading around in tide pools down by MDI harvesting seaweed. And so she's literally been eating seaweed since she was in the womb. And
Wow, that's so cool.
yeah, and it's such a cool facility. And seaweed is somewhat unique to kind of the culinary food scene here in Maine. There isn't any other state in the country that has the diversity of seaweeds that we have. And I think as a chef, you know, people want to get excited about Italian truffles or, Spanish ham. We've got incredible seaweed, right? This is part of our culinary fabric, part of our identity as cooks, and part of our identity of our cuisine. We should see more seaweed on the menu. And Cherie took our instructors on an adventure, kind of exploring what seaweed looks like, kind of in some of its wild forms, in a touch tank. And then we got to go on a tour of their processing facility. And then because Cherie is such an incredible educator, she actually put together these fantastic packets with all kinds of information, sample products, and led us on a culinary adventure that night in their kitchens, where we cooked dinner and incorporated seaweed into almost every component of our entire meal, which was really exciting. And even the bus driver, who was like, "I'm not eating seaweed," was like, "This stuff is delicious," you know, and then
That's awesome.
and really liked it by the end of the night. So it was a heck of a first dinner stop. And we sat outside with Serafina and Cherie, and it was like a beautiful summer Maine evening. And it was just the perfect way to wind down from what was, a lot of anticipation and kind of stress that oh my God, is this tour that I dreamed up going to go right?
Yeah.
And it went so right, And,
So what is, if I look at that, I'm like somebody looking at Indian spices going, I don't know what to do with that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like I look at it and I'm like, I don't know what to do with that stuff. So
Yeah.
what would I do with that stuff?
Yeah, so I think that is often the question that cooks ask themselves about seaweed, and they make it a little too complicated sometimes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I saw, because we brought these products on our tour, one of the things that I saw young people really enjoying, and young people are a great barometer for whether or not something is palatable, because they have no filter,
Right.
They were using it as a seasoning for things like potatoes, right? So I saw mashed potatoes seasoned with smoked dulse at least 5 times, and every time I absolutely loved eating it. Cherie has an incredible corn chowder recipe that she uses smoked dulse and alaria in, and it stands in place of bacon, where it's this kind of salty, umami umami-rich element that obviously is, seaweed and not, land-based pork, which is really exciting as we think about, the future.
The pork of the sea.
Eating more lightly. There's a ton of potential for seaweed, and again, I would encourage people not to pigeonhole it into Asian cuisine, because I think that's the natural inclination of most cooks is that, I'm going to make a Japanese or a Chinese recipe because, they use it all the time for things like miso soup or sushi, but there's so much more application beyond that, and I think a really unique opportunity here in Maine to kind of define that narrative, right? That our generation of cooks can capitalize on this product and make it our own, and have people not think of miso soup, but have people think of corn chowder. And that's really an exciting opportunity. And everybody should try mango sea veg.
I think you need to have like a chop challenge and just put all of that in a basket and see what comes out of it. And do it with the kids. That would be fun.
Yeah, totally.
On the next tour.
100%.
Yeah.
And so that concluded our first day. And then the next morning we woke up and we started our tour off with what was one of my most favorite stops of the whole trip. We went from Ellsworth down to Harborside, Maine, and in Harborside we visited Elliott Coleman at Four Seasons Farm. And if you like gardening, or if you've been following along with organic farming here in Maine, you know the name Elliott Coleman, right?
So tell us who Elliott Coleman is.
So Elliott's a legend. He came to Maine in the 60s and started farming there in Harborside and decided he was going to farm differently. He was going to farm organically. He was going to build soil. He wasn't going to use pesticides. He wasn't going to use synthetic fertilizers. And he was going to focus on soil health, and he was going to focus on what some people might call biodynamic farming practices. Elliott did that successfully now for almost 60 years, has passed the farm on to a second generation, to his daughter, who's now running the farm, Clara. And in doing so, he has trained an unknown number of, kind of farm apprentices. He's put together an incredible program on the farm where farm managers have a 1-year stay, and during that stay they have an understudy who becomes the farm manager the following year. What Elliott's real claim to fame is not only farming organically, but doing it year-round here in Maine. So he has products available, 365 days a year, and a lot of times he has products, like tomatoes ready in June or May, when most, gardeners here in Maine wouldn't see a tomato until August, right? And he's doing that through high tunnels, through greenhouses, through really, intentional crop rotations, and just an amazing farm. And Elliott is, oh gosh, don't quote me on this, but I believe he's in his early 80s. He spent an hour and a half with our group walking us around the farm, answering every question, staying completely on track, just as sharp as a whip, as sweet as could be. It was an incredible day, and I'm an avid gardener, but my garden doesn't hold a candle to Elliott Coleman's. I took my hand and I dipped it into his soil all the way up to my wrist. He has 6 inches of soft, fluffy, incredible dirt, and that's a testament to 60 years of good farming practices.
That's awesome.
It's a really magical place. He has a farmer's market there on Saturdays, so well worth the trip. It's way the heck out there. You'll be like, wow, where am I? But you'll eventually get there, and it's awesome. But leaving Elliott Coleman's farm, we made a trip over to Tender Hearth in Brooksville. And Tender Hearth is kind of a relative newcomer on Maine's food scene. It's Tim and Lydia. Tim and Lydia have started what is a really romantic bakery in Brooksville, Maine. They're baking in an old farmhouse that Tim grew up in, and they are doing incredible. They started out doing just wood-fired breads and pastries. They've since grown to a larger steam oven so they can keep up with the demand. But what has really taken off for them has been their pizza nights. Pizza night at Tender Hearth is an absolutely magical experience.
Why?
You go there, you can walk around barefoot through their gardens while kids play. You sit at a picnic table and drink rosé and eat farm-fresh vegetables and incredible artisan pizza. And it just is like, I don't know, it feels like you've been invited to some bohemian commune, that everybody loves you, and, you get to all dance around the fire at the end of the night kind of thing. It's just an experience, and it's part of that kind of experiential dining of like clean, good Maine food that is so special. But their facility was amazing, and it's a neat They bake with a lot of Maine-grown grains, and they obviously live on a farm, so they use a lot of their own produce. They also use a lot of Elliott's produce because they're, literally like 11 minutes up the road.
Right.
And it's a really cool place. It was neat to have the instructors see a bakery, and so we got to see, inside the bakery and all their cool cloches, and that's their brand new big steam tube oven. And we were, right in the kitchen in the middle of a busy production shift, so Tim had to wedge himself in between a bunch of baking racks while, all of his tattooed employees, got grumpy about us being in their way. And then we went outside, and that was actually the first oven that they built there, a Quebecois Cop oven, which they only use kind of for special events now, but that's their bar. So if you go there, it's kind of a DIY dinner service. You go and get your drinks from the bar and go back to your picnic table, but it's a pretty cool vibe. We had lunch there, so we took some of our smoked salmon that we got from Cook Aquaculture, because we got smoked and fresh salmon from them, and Tim toasted off some delicious croissants. Laminated doughs are really they're good at a lot of things. But
how do you get this stuff? Where do you have to drive all the way to Maine to get it?
They do a farm drop kind of thing where you can get on like a list for when they show up at a certain parking lot at a certain time, and it happens at like the Rinnies in Belfast. Like there'll all of a sudden be this huge cluster of people all sitting around, and then this truck will roll up and unload all these paper bags, and everybody will drive away, and you'll be like, "What just happened?" Because it's like a
Is it a croissant delivery?
Exactly. You think it's like a cocaine distribution or something.
Bread is the new cocaine
but
in Maine.
It's croissants.
So that's what we do.
But no, you can go there and you can enjoy their croissants. They do distribute to a couple of places, but honestly, they've gotten so busy, their distribution has gotten less and less, and they've been doing more of this kind of direct to customer stuff. But I think that exclusivity drives the kind of demand and excitement sometimes. But we had fabulous croissants with smoked salmon for lunch, and it was really a treat. And all the instructors were like, "Wow, this is delicious." They got it. And I mean, again, we were like, it was a beautiful Maine summer day. We're in a gorgeous garden. Like, it was just the total experience, the immersion of it was really cool. Leaving there, we traveled to Bangor, and we got to visit our Pineland Farms dairy on One Milk Street in Bangor, which is really an incredible facility and an awesome testament to Mark Whitney and his talent as a cheesemaker.
Can you tell us who Mark Whitney is? Because I actually spoke with him today.
So Mark's this incredible guy that's been making cheese for Pineland for a number of years, back when he used to have almost like a garage cheese-making facility in New Gloucester, but he was winning so many awards and making such exceptional cheese, the Pineland Farms Group invested in him to buy what used to be the Garlic Milk Processing Facility in Bangor and turn it into this kind of, world-class cheese processing plant. And this is really just a testament to how awesome Mark is, and how talented he is. So what is exciting about this is it's created infrastructure for a ton of Maine farms to sell Maine milk to make Maine cheese. And so that's the beauty of like food processing and value-added food, is it creates a lot of economic opportunity for farms, right? So, cheese is a really condensed form of milk, right? It takes a whole lot of milk to make not that much cheese. And that's what's really beautiful about this. They buy the milk. They produce a lot of relatively shelf-stable, valuable product that people love to eat. I don't know about you guys, but I love eating cheese, right? Yeah. And their facility is immaculate. There's a few pictures here. Everything is spotless, sparkling clean. Really cool to see, the large-scale kind of production facility. This gentleman was working the big cheese vat, making a batch of spicy cheddar, and it's huge.
I've actually had that.
Yeah,
I bought that.
Huge amounts of cheese, and they're tossing the salt and the pepper mash into it. It's real ingredients. Like that's blended up peppers. Getting blended into it. It's not artificial flavors being added in. Pineland maybe doesn't have the the kind of boutique image that some of our smaller cheesemakers have, but they're making legit cheese, and just doing it at a scale that really creates community opportunity for dairies. So pretty cool. And then we did a little tour of their storage facility, and headed from Pineland down to the MAFCA campus in Unity, and I'm on the board at MAFCA, which has been a really exciting opportunity for me, and I'm just like tickled pink to be part of it. I feel like so honored to be part of that group of people. They're doing such important work, and they have been for so many years, and it's a remarkable group of humans that serve at MAFCA, both as employees and board members. One of the things that we got to visit while we were there was their heritage orchard. And the heritage orchard is cool because they're preserving a lot of apple varieties that otherwise would be lost. And it was a neat primer for some of the instructors to learn about the unique kind of history of apples and the unique method of reproduction for apples. Apples don't grow true to seed, so you can't plant an apple seed from your favorite apple and regrow those apples. You actually have to use a grafting method where you graft it onto rootstock, and it's a whole thing, and apple people are crazy about apples, and there's a bunch of them there at MAFCA. And so we toured the orchard, which was neat, and then we headed back to MAFCA's what would be the exhibition hall at the Common Ground Fair. But MAFCA actually has their offices there as well as a commercial kitchen. And I was able to work with some really awesome farmers from the area, Polly Shaika and Prentice from Village Side Farm. And we did this really cool collaboration where they invited some local farmers, and we got to cook produce from the farms with the farmers. And that was really neat, because typically as a chef, your relationship with the farmer is somewhat transactional. They grow something, you buy it, you do your thing, they do their thing, and there's not a lot of engagement. But this was a very intentional engagement between the two of them. And the perfect example of that was Prentice and one of the chefs were talking about kohlrabi, and the chef was like, well, I don't ever peel kohlrabi. And Prentice is like, you should absolutely peel kohlrabi. And that was like, one of those things where I think chefs maybe get a little too much credit about how much they know about food. A chef doesn't know as much about vegetables as a person that grows vegetables every day, every year for their entire lives,
Right.
And it was neat to kind of have the farmers get to share that. The other unintended outcome of that was that the farmers felt incredibly seen and appreciated, and those people work unbelievably hard during the farm season, and then for a lot of them it was the first time they had sat down to a meal of good fresh seasonal vegetables that whole summer. And that was really impactful and kind of neat, and something that Polly and I are actually going to pursue some funding to put together a series of dinners to support farmers, just as part of the Farmer Resiliency Network. There's a lot of stress in farming and a lot of depression and unfortunately high suicide rates and so on. So we want to do some work to support our farming community and make them feel loved and help them enjoy the fruits of their labor. And
that's awesome.
So more to come on that, but MAFCA's awesome and a great stop. Our next morning, we headed to what was my favorite stop of the whole trip, because I have so much love for Amber Lamke at Maine Grains. She's just an incredible person, and we're so lucky to have her here in Maine. But there was still room in my heart to find an equal amount of love for her sister, Heather. And Heather I got to meet for the first time on this tour. And Heather has started a secondary company called The Good Crust. The Good Crust is a Maine pizza dough brand making pizza dough using 100% Maine grains. So what's equally cool about that is they started their facility in Canaan, Maine, about 6 miles down the road from Maine Grains. And much like Amber, Heather had a previous professional life where she was doing incredible work as an occupational therapist. What Heather realized during that career was that there weren't opportunities for people with physical and intellectual disabilities to enter into the workforce and have gainful and meaningful employment, and she has built that at the Good Crust. She employs, I believe about a dozen people, creating job opportunities for them where they can make a living and make an income while making an exceptional Maine product that is absolutely delicious. And so, as part of our tour at Maine Grains, we got to not only experience the deliciousness that is Good Crust, but we got to tour the Maine Grains facility, which I'll briefly touch on as a remarkable place.
Amber and Heather are identical twins.
Indeed, yeah.
And so they were, one's a speech pathologist, one's an occupational therapist, and now they're both basically pioneers in the food scene.
Totally.
Maine Grains and Maine, sort of craft Maine pizza, which is very cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're so lucky to have them. What a cool family.
Yeah.
I'd love
I can
to
imagine them cooking up a storm.
Yeah, I'd love to be invited to Thanksgiving.
They're going to live to 200 because they eat so healthy.
Yeah. So a little bit about the context of what Maine Grains is. So, because Maine Grains is a cool story, and I'll move through it relatively quickly. So, Amber got involved in the kind of local food movement in Skowhegan while she was still working as a speech pathologist, and she was realized that there was a missing element of milling infrastructure, right? So there were people in Maine that could grow grains, and there were people in Maine that wanted to eat those grains, but there was no one to turn those grains into something edible, right? Because when you grow wheat, what you can see there in the picture is unhulled, right, unground wheat. And that is not something that most of us in our home kitchens have the capacity to turn into bread, right? So what Maine Grains does is they use a stone mill, and they actually grind up locally grown grains into flour. They also grind up local grains into things like pearled barley and farro, and it creates, again, opportunity for Maine farms to grow those crops and opportunity for Maine eaters to eat those crops, which is really exciting. And what's neat about Maine Grains is they're using kind of an old world technique where they're using a stone mill, and that stone mill is neat because it maintains, that's actually the stone mill right there, it maintains a lot more of the nutrition of the grain than modern roller mills, which is what you see out in the West where there's really large scale monoculture wheat production. Right. Those mills are actually designed to remove all of the perishable elements of the grain and make it really shelf stable where it won't spoil. In doing so, they're removing a lot of the nutrients that are essential to our health.
All the good stuff.
Exactly, and all in an effort to make it shelf stable. So Maine Grains has decided to make more integral flour that is more nutritious but has a shorter shelf life. And in addition to that, they're also making flour and working with varieties of flour that are more delicious as well. They're doing that work through the Maine Grain Alliance. The Maine Grain Alliance is a really cool organization that Amber's been a part of, and they're also, we've got some pictures coming up here of one of the kind of cornerstone elements of that, which is the kneading conference that happens in Skowhegan as well. And that's been kind of something that has been a baby of the Maine Grains movement. And the kneading conference has become this almost a worldwide phenomenon at this point, where people are traveling to Skowhegan to learn about all things milling and grains, because as Amber will tell you, when she first started, there was nowhere to learn about this. You know, she went to Kansas to learn about milling, and they had a book from like the 40s in their library that they pointed her to, and that was the best they could do to help her out with learning about stone milling. So she's literally been on a worldwide journey learning about stone milling, and has now created this incredible thing in Skowhegan where people are coming to learn about that as well. One of the neat things about Amber's facility in Skowhegan is she actually took the Somerset County Jail and turned it into this like kind of, you know, modern food innovation hub there where they're doing incredible things. And one of the additional tenants within that facility is Crooked Face Creamery, which is Amy Rowbottom, and she makes absolutely to die for ricotta cheese. In addition to some other products, but her ricotta cheese is out of this world.
Yeah, she's won awards for that.
She has, and she has some amazing new smoked butter now that she's partnering with Casco Bay Creamery on, and so we got to visit that, and we actually got to take both dough from the Good Crust and cheese from Crooked Face, and all the instructors got to cook pizza in a wood-fired oven that day.
That's
and I could have stayed there for the rest of the trip and just never left. You know, that was it for me. But it was really awesome, and highly encourage you to go check out the Miller's Table and Maine Grains. It is such an awesome place to visit, and definitely support Amber. You know, that's voting with your food dollars when you buy Maine Grains.
Love it.
Leaving there, we ended up in your neck of the woods here. So here we are at Mook Sea Farm. Mook Sea Farm is really special. Bill Mook is someone that I met through my work with the Alliance for Maine's Marine Economy, and Bill connected me with Steve Zimmerman, and Steve is the Chief Operating Officer at Mook Sea Farm. He coordinated our tour, and we got to see what makes Mook Sea Farm so truly special. And part of that is their oyster holding facility. So they've got a land-based recirculating kind of holding facility where they can take oysters out of the Dumas River and hold them on land in a closed loop system. So if there ever was a river closure for stormwater reasons or whatever, they wouldn't lose the ability to sell their oysters. And they also use their little oyster pound, as you could call it, to hold other farms' oysters as well, kind of creating some stability in the market in the event that we had a river closure for, typically it's because of a high water event where you might have levels of bacteria in the river from storm runoff. But either way, pretty cool that they've done that, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, what makes them really cool. Here you can see Steve kind of taking us on a tour of what makes Mook Sea Farm so special, which is their hatchery. And so what they're doing is they're actually producing oyster seed that other oyster farms then buy from them to grow their own oysters. So what you see in this picture right here are literally millions of oysters. So every tiny little speck in those buckets is a baby oyster that's going to be grown out either in the Daramuscata River or rivers beyond, and that is so cool. Like that's the next couple years of oysters that we're going to see on menus and restaurants all throughout the Northeast, and maybe beyond. They're all right there. And so Mook Sea Farm has put an incredible amount of work into developing their brood stock and their process for developing seed, as well as for feeding and growing out that seed. There's a cool picture here of this bubbly tank of yummy goodness, and that's what oysters eat. And Mook Sea Farm has done so much work to develop these specific algae and so on that they can reproduce and feed to their baby oysters to grow healthy, vibrant, successful baby oysters for farmers to put into their plots. So really, really cool. And every one of the chef instructors left there with a whole new appreciation for oysters and how cool the Maine oyster scene is. But of course we left with some delicious oysters.
Of course.
And we headed over to our Maine Tasting Center, which should be coming up here momentarily, which is another treasure here in Wiscasset. So Sarah, which is Andy and Elizabeth's daughter, was a wonderful ambassador for them, welcomed us into their demo center, and inside their demo facility, which is pictured here, much more attractively set up with Cherie's demo than with mine. But what we got to do is we got to work with some awesome researchers from the Darling Marine Center. So maybe some folks in this audience know Dana Morse, but if you don't, Dana is so awesome. Dana is growing some of those aforementioned mussels and oysters and scallops. And here he's with one of our chefs from the tour demonstrating how you actually shuck a whole scallop. Now, because these were grown at the DMC grow plot, we could only use the adductor mussel because they're not being monitored like the ones at Pin Bay or Vertical Bay. But pretty interesting. Most chefs don't get an opportunity here in Maine to work with whole scallops because they're shucked at sea.
Sure.
So it was neat for all the chef instructors to see that. We also had, not pictured here, Jacqueline Robideau, who's a Sea Grant employee as well, showing us about oysters and also talking about kelp, which kelp is really, Jacqueline's like bread and butter. Her license plate is eat kelp, she's eats, sleeps, drinks it. But really cool to get to work with the researchers, and then we produced just a fabulous meal there.
That's ceviche, right?
Yeah,
is that scallop ceviche?
It is. It was so good, and they used this grapefruit vinegar from Fiore that we picked up the previous day. Really fabulous. I mean, we had an absolutely delicious meal there. We spent the night in Bath, and then the next morning we woke up and visited another wonderful folks right in your backyard. We went over to see Dan at Broad Arrow Farm, and Broad Arrow Farm folks is really doing pork right. They're raising incredibly happy pigs. They're doing so with a really minimal impact to the environment, which is what I think is maybe one of the most exciting things about it. On my formative culinary years, I read a lot of books about industrial agriculture, and one of the books that really stuck with me was by Nicolette Hahn Niemann, and it was called The Righteous Pork Chop, and it talked at length about her work as part of the Riverkeeper Association in the Mid-Atlantic, and how bad those big industrial pork farms down there were as an environmental threat to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Because what would happen is you'd have a hurricane move in because you have so many animals being raised in these kind of concrete slatted facilities, and all of their manure being collected in lagoons. You have basically these EPA Superfund sites just waiting to happen. The hurricanes move in, the levees break, and you've got incredible amounts of effluent entering the river systems and essentially killing everything in the estuary. The way that Broad Arrow is raising pork, they're raising it on the land in a woodlot pasture, and all of the effluent from the pigs, so all of the nutrients that the pigs release, are actually regenerating and improving the environment they're being raised on, right? So they're building soil health, they're building pasture, they're building healthy woods, and in the process producing incredibly delicious, happy, healthy pork. And in addition to that, what's really kind of cool about what they're doing there is they've got a team of chefs who are working as processors, adding value to that pork. And that is one of what I think is one of the most interesting intersections of culinary arts and agriculture that we saw on our tour, right? So they have chefs from 4 Street, they have chefs from Primo, and those folks have brought their skills and been able to add additional value to Dan's already exceptional value pork that he's producing. And so the chefs have gotten an opportunity to have a different quality of life, a different schedule, a different kind of work environment, and he's gotten to have incredibly good opportunity to sell pork in various forms, to get it into the mouths of more consumers. And they've opened this really cool thing called the Rooting Pig. The Rooting Pig is their charcuterie bar that they have there, and it's a cool opportunity to literally sit out in their pasture. You can watch piglets wrestle and tumble around under the oak trees, and you can eat this just exceptional menu of dry cured and fresh sausages and so on. It's a great experience. We were all just blown away. I mean, I probably ate a half a cup of pig fat spread on fish focaccia. It was unreal good. So really a treat, wonderful place, right in your backyard. You guys should all go visit.
And they're at the farmer's market every Friday as well.
Yeah.
So if you can't get to the farm, they come to you, which is great.
Yeah, and you told me about their pork chop and how it was your first experience eating pork, right? Like
no, it's not my first experience eating pork.
But you had never had pork like that before.
Pork like that, yeah. So I actually went there to deliver my sauces for the first time ever, and I was just as wowed as you were. They didn't have the Rooting Pig then, but we were just coming out of COVID at that point, and I remember just looking at the animals and how happy they were, and they had no sense of what was coming, but of course they were just so happy. But it was great, because I walked away, and I remember Dwayne, who was the chef at Primo. He said to me, Cherie, you have to go home with some pork chops. So you just have to do it. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. And so he sent me home with some pork chops, and that afternoon, I think it was Memorial Day weekend, we fired up the grill. I threw them on the grill, and I had, I think, a jar of sog around, and I just took them and I brushed my sog, the Indian sog, right on those pork chops on this charcoal grill. And I put it on a platter with nothing around it, like you were at Sardi's in New York City. They just give you a pork chop. And I gave it to my husband, Guy, and he said, okay. And he said, I don't like pork chops. I said, you just need to try it. Dwayne said, you just need to try it. And he cut into it, and he didn't even need his knife. It just fell apart. And he put it in his mouth, and he's like, oh my God, that's the best fat I've ever tried in my life. Like, it was delicious, delicious, yeah. And I've never had an Indian pork chop before, but it was a true Mumbai to Maine experience, and it really was exceptional. So I echo that. Yeah. It really was yum.
And what a treat. And I mean, and Dan's also just an exceptionally nice guy, and really building a cool little bit of community down there.
Yeah, and they have a really badass female butcher, and her name's Anna. And if you haven't seen her around, she has a machete around her. And she is as cute and fiery as she is there in that photo, and she's in person, and she loves what she does.
Well, and Dan's daughters are part of the business too, which was really cool. We got to meet them while we were there as well, awesome. which was awesome. But yeah, really an awesome place.
Pork. Yeah, that's the pork chop.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
There it is.
I speak from what I know.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. But so leaving Bristol, we headed down to Cumberland, Maine, just outside of Portland, for our final stop of the tour. where we were welcomed to Pine Ridge Acres. And so Pine Ridge Acres is a grass-fed beef operation, and so they've got a couple hundred head of cattle that they raise. It's kind of funny. It's like, literally the suburbs of Portland have like swallowed their farm up. So there's like houses all around their farm. It feels like you're in a neighborhood with this, like beef operation happening right there. And they've got this really cool farm store and some wonderful people working there. We had a great time getting to meet the cows. I had a cow blow snot on me, and then we went up to their farm store and they grilled up some awesome sausages, sent us home with a ton of caramel corn, and we're just
It's cattle corn.
Oh, kettle corn. Oh, cattle corn. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
it's kind of cool.
Yeah, and they sent us home with just the best kind of send off from our trip,
awesome.
and it was neat, to kind of get to see so many aspects of Maine's food system and kind of see these recurring themes of hard work, good stewardship of the land, and and really caring about both your customer and the product that you're producing. So
yeah, and what's interesting to me in all of this, you haven't even touched on lobster, which is of course our crown jewel here, but it's great that you were able to touch on so much else. So, I guess I should talk about the elephant in the room. Tell me how you feel about the whole right whale and the lobstermen and everything that's going on.
So I guess it's worth pointing out the reason that lobster was absent from our trip is that lobster is considered a wild fishery and not part of agriculture. Based on that definition, we didn't include it in our exploration of ag literacy. But certainly our lobstermen are experiencing a really tough time right now with this kind of red listing of their product and it being viewed as unsustainable, largely based on very little scientific data as I understand it. My understanding is 0 and 0 are the things to remember, right? 0 entanglements and 0 deaths. And I think that we as a community should support one of our most iconic fisheries here. We should still be supporting our lobstermen. We should be eating lobster and encouraging our friends and neighbors to do so too. I think that this is a part of our fabric of who we are here in Maine and something we shouldn't lose.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that. And I know we're running up on time here, so I want to give our audience a chance to just kind of take a chance to ask you some questions that have probably been mulling on their minds for a while. So I'm going to invite you guys. First of all, thank you for this amazing tour. I feel like that was a master class in Maine food systems, as fast as you could spit it out.
I tried to go quick.
I know we could sit here for 4 hours, Rob, and we would then have to cook up a feast with whatever's around here. So I'm so glad you gave us the high level on it, but it was really fun. So does anybody have any questions for Rob? He is a trove of information, and I warned you, be careful what you ask him because he knows something about everything in Maine food system. So he'd love to answer some questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm just going to ask you for one quick thing. When you ask the question, Rob is going to repeat the question because this is being filmed. So just so you know.
When will you start leading tours for all of us?
So the question is, when will I start leading tours for the general public or for everyone? And that's a great question, and it's funny you mentioned that because I have a friend or someone that I admire in the area. Her name's Vanessa Santarelli, and she runs Your Maine Concierge. And I've been to some of Vanessa's dinners that she does for industry folks, and I've thought to myself, like, following this trip, like, wow, I wonder if I could kind of do some sort of a supplement to that where I create like ag experiences for people. And, I won't say it's off the table. I'd have to divide myself into two people and figure out how to start a business while doing my current job. But it would be an interesting thing to do, and I would love to kind of explore, the feasibility of that at some point.
Absolutely. I think, Rob, you need your own podcast.
Oh,
you
geez.
should totally develop your own podcast. Any other questions here for Rob?
Yeah.
Hi.
What's going on in the mushroom cultivation area?
Oh. Did you pay her to ask that question, Cherie?
I didn't have to
All
because
right.
I think they pretty much could see that beautiful mushroom sitting there. Do you want to pick up that mushroom and tell us what that's all about?
Let me repeat the question. So the question was, what's going on with mushroom cultivation?
Right.
And so I love that question because I absolutely love mushrooms. And actually, I brought some presents for Cherie that Cherie was like, we need to share these as props. And,
props.
And
I'm
so,
taking them all home.
Yes, edible props for Cherie to enjoy for dinner tomorrow.
Just kidding.
And so
I missed the farmer's market on
Yeah,
Friday,
and so I brought a couple of different mushrooms
Careful.
here. Oop, we're
I
getting
think
some
it's-
feedback,
yeah, you're
maybe
gonna
from the mushroom. Anyway, so I brought a couple of different mushrooms here, and the question was specifically around cultivation, which would be kind of a different group of mushrooms than what we would find wild. So in my right hand here, I'm holding some shiitake mushrooms. And these shiitake mushrooms are something that I'm actually growing at my home on inoculated oak logs. And we've got an incredible company here in Maine called North Sport. They're one of a few different folks who are selling grow kits in various different formats. I started out by buying a dowel spawn from them, and dowel spawn's essentially a little wooden dowel. You drill a hole in the appropriate type of wood, hammer the dowel in, and then in a period of time it will start to grow mushrooms for you. The challenge with dowels is it's somewhat cost prohibitive to really do at any degree of scale, and I really like mushrooms, so I wanted to grow a hell of a lot of them. So I invested in a sawdust spawn kit where I could actually use like a 5-pound bag of sawdust that had been inoculated with the specific strain of mushroom, and then make my own little plugs that I can punch into logs. And that's what, these are actually logs I did this spring. And it was a wonderful experience with several of my colleagues and friends where we all got together in my garage in March, and we just had a log plugging party all afternoon and ate chocolate chip cookies, and it was a great time, honestly. And now we're enjoying the fruits of our labor as all of our logs have started fruiting with shiitakes. Now, not all mushrooms can be grown in a cultivated setting. Some mushrooms need to be grown in a forest environment that's supportive of their specific kind of desired friends, right? So the different groups would be saprophytic mushroom, which is a primary decomposer, which is what your shiitake or oysters would fall into. And then the other is your mycorrhizal mushrooms. And this is not an example of a mycorrhizal mushroom. This is also a saprophytic. This is a hen of the woods, or Grifola frondosa, and these are particularly prolific this time of year, growing at the base of big oak trees. And so if you happen to live in an area that's got several old growth oaks, I would highly encourage you to take a gander around their base. And they call these the hen of the woods because they look very much like a hen nesting at the bottom of that tree. And they're absolutely fantastic to eat. These have been cultured in a lab to be able to be grown on logs as well, though the cultivation method for them is deemed by North Sport to be expert level, because you got to pasteurize the log, you got to bury it under the ground. There's all this stuff you have to do it that's so much more complicated than growing a shiitake. Now, the flip side of that would be your chanterelles, your morels, your black trumpets. Those mushrooms fall into a family you would call a mycorrhizal mushroom. And so those are still decomposing forest matter, but they're not growing on a specific medium. They're growing in relationship to tree hosts or other plant hosts. And those cannot be cultivated because we can't mimic that forest environment. And so there are some mushrooms that will always kind of be a forager's treat or a wild treat, and will never really be widely available, while other mushrooms can certainly be done at scale and sometimes done in really innovative ways using waste mediums as their growth substrate. There have been some interesting research in Vermont with using spent straw from dairies to grow oyster mushrooms and so on. And that's what's really cool about mushrooms is you literally turn waste into food, and highly nutritious, highly delicious food. And it does bear mentioning that the mushroom is not the organism, right? So this grows from the mycelium, and the mycelium is the actual organism. So, growing around the roots of that oak tree that this mushroom sprouted out of is a huge mat of mycelium that we can't see. And then this mushroom is similar to like the apple on the apple tree or the blueberry on the blueberry bush. When you harvest it, you're not ripping up the organism. You're just taking the fruit off of the organism that's below the ground. And it will reproduce another one the next year in most instances, which is really exciting. So don't share your hen tree with anybody else. I definitely won't tell you where I found these. So go ahead.
You didn't talk, I've just been reading something about Blue Baron up in Camden, about them taking blueberries and doing a distillery and doing gin that supposedly isn't done anywhere else in the world. And also we have grapes and other things. What's your feeling about all that? And
Yeah.
do you include that?
So yes, there is some really exciting stuff going on with wild blueberries. and making wine, making champagne. I should repeat the question. So the question was around the exciting work being done with distillation and brewing with wild blueberries here in Maine. And so I'm not terribly familiar with Blue Baron and their distillation. The company that I am fairly familiar with is Blewett. And Blewett is making incredible champagne using the traditional champagne method, but using wild blueberries instead of grapes. And what's unique about wild blueberries is they're one of the few cultivated, though wild blueberries really are only kind of loosely cultivated, fruits that lend themselves well to making a true wine. You know, it's not like plum wine or apple wine or something like that where it's just kind of, you know, alcoholic juice. They're making real true terroir-driven product, right? You can taste a lot of acidity, you can taste a lot of minerals, you can, you know, really kind of get a sense of place when you drink it. And it's a connoisseur's product, you know, like the people that like Mike's Hard Lemonade or like Boone's Farm wine are not going to be down with Blewett, you know, but the people that like champagne and like, you know, high-end wines are going to love Blewett. It's a phenomenal product.
Good luck getting your hands on it because it's always out every time.
Oh, really?
I have 2 bottles and I don't ever open them.
Yeah.
I just treasure them.
Oh,
I have
that's
a
awesome.
Vermont and the champagne. It's delicious.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's so good. Yeah. And so you're also a big fan of beans and squash. I know that you weren't able to bring any beans here today, but tell us a little bit about that.
Only because I was too lazy to shuck them for you, but so I do really love pumpkins and squash as a kind of they're a great example of food security that we can all achieve, right? You know, the winter squash, the pumpkin, is something that's been an important part of, you know, people in New England feeding themselves going all the way back to the indigenous people living here. And it still should be a part of our diet today, in my opinion, because they are one of those garden crops that you can grow with relatively little effort, and then preserving them is as simple as, you know, removing them from the vine in the fall and storing them somewhere, you know, nice and dry. And they will be a great repository of delicious calories and nutrients that you can enjoy all winter long. I've been, of course, you know, like all chefs, I'm always in the pursuit of the things that people say taste the best. And this is a unique pumpkin that I finally had some success growing this year. These are called black futsu, which are a Japanese heirloom pumpkin that has a really dense flesh that apparently tastes like chestnut. And I know, you know, my friend Cherie here is a connoisseur of good things, so I wanted to
some pumpkin chestnut soup.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring you one of my very best pumpkins to enjoy.
Thank you.
And
so what's the profile on that? Is it sweet or savory?
Well, it's supposed to be kind of nutty. And kind of kind of a very dense, meaty, chestnutty flavor. So not as sweet as like a sugar pie pumpkin or something like that. But I haven't honestly tried one yet. The thing to know about pumpkins, and I've kind of, you know, maybe learned this the hard way, is they're really not very good right after they're picked. They need a period to cure. And so I hold them in my garage, which has kind of like a little bit of a greenhouse effect this time of year. It stays pretty warm in there. And the pumpkins go through a curing period, which allows for their rind to harden up, which helps prevent disease and rot. But it also allows the starches to begin converting to sugar. If you've ever grown butternut squash, they last incredibly long. And when you eat a butternut squash in like March or April, you know, which is, you know, 6 months after you picked it from the ground, it tastes like candy. You know, it's so sweet. It's like it's you don't even need to add sugar to it. If you were to make a dessert, they're so stinking good. And that's something that really, like, you only get to experience as like a home gardener or a supporter of local farms.
Right.
You know, and so so pretty cool. So you can eat this now, or you can wait a couple months and eat it, and it'll be even sweeter and more delicious. And
So tell us about these potatoes. You've got potatoes. Tell us what you have here. And you have, like, you're very proud about your celery. So he wants to show you his celery.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and the carrots and the herbs,
Yeah, so just some beautiful fall crops that we're, you know, very proud of from our little homestead in Prospect. Grew some, this is Johnny's variety called Tango, which has done incredibly well for us. You know, celery is something I'm relatively new to having any kind of bumper supply of. So I'm adventuring in some new preservation techniques this year, going to try dehydrating it. I'm going to try combining it with carrots and onions and cooking it like a mirepoix that I can then use as and then actually freezing that cooked mixture as something I can add into, you know, stocks and soups and stews later on. But the neat thing about growing your own celery is you get to experience a lot more of the foliage. And the foliage on celery is actually really pretty darn delicious and very edible, but often is you know, cut off and discarded when you buy celery at the grocery store, because it's more perishable than the stalks, you know. So so it's all about getting that kind of maximum shelf life. But yeah, we just, you know.
These carrots are beautiful.
So
you just dug these up today?
I did, yeah. We dug up some. These are mochums, which mochums are a super sweet carrot. White satins, yellow stones, and then these are a cosmic purple carrot, which are really cool. You know, the mochums are definitely the best tasting and storing of the bunch. I don't even really love the taste of the white satins, but it's such a unique kind of color contrast that, you know, you just, I don't know, you sometimes you eat with your eyes and not your, you know, not anything else. So I do grow multicolored carrots just for that.
Do you do anything with the carrot tops, or like do you just?
You know, they are edible, and you can make things. I hear about people doing things like pestos and so on, but they don't rank terribly high on my list of edible greens or herbs. You know, like this time of year, my parsley is just like doing incredibly well. You know,
you bought me an entire like bouquet of herbs here.
Yeah, I brought you some nice winter herbs and some parsley.
Man, do you ever sleep, or are you always gardening?
Oh, gardening doesn't require that much dedication. It's hard, but it's not that hard. But
kill everything I grow. So no, this is pretty amazing. And this was all in your garden in your homestead in Prospect.
These are all things that I brought you
you've
to
got aliens
enjoy.
And pumpkins and everything. Wow, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So what's like your favorite fall dish, since we're all sort of in the heels of fall here? We're hitting the farmer's market tomorrow morning in Damascotta. What should we be cooking up this weekend?
You know, I think if I was cooking up something this weekend, I'm going to be cooking some fall mushrooms, right? So I might be making a nice salsa verde with my parsley here, some of my garlic from the garden. Probably going to be cutting these maitakes because I didn't maybe tell you, but I kept a couple of these for myself too. You
jipped me.
But I'm going to cut those into steaks, and I'm going to cook them on a plancha, so like a flat top, pressed under a griddle. I'm going to do like a maitake mushroom steak. I'll probably baste it. I'll make like a little herb brush like this, and I'll brush it with clarified butter while it's basting, or to baste it. Make that nice chimichurri with the parsley. Might do some smashed potatoes. These are some really fun fingerlings. Actually, Dr. Porter at the University of Maine bred this variety. It's called a Pinto Gold, and it's a fabulous little creamer fingerling potato.
Where do you find that? At Rob's house?
Well,
How did you get that?
Johnny's sells this as a seed potato variety, and then you can plant and grow them. There are a few farms in Aroostook County that grow them as well, so you can occasionally find them. You know, if you make a trip up north this time of year, everybody's got these really cute little farm stands, these like honor system potato stands, and you can pop in and buy potatoes from those, and they have Pinto Golds there sometimes.
So we're all coming over this weekend to Prospect?
I mean, I can feed probably about 3 extra people. I got enough mushrooms for that.
You got enough mushrooms?
So, yeah.
All right, you got 2 at home. I'll keep tabs on that. But how awesome was tonight? This was so informational. You were literally a walking encyclopedia, walking and talking. Thank you so much for joining us. And you have like, what, a 3-hour ride home? 2.5 hour ride home?
No, it's about 2 hours. So that's not too bad.
Well, thank you so much for coming all the way to Damascotta. It was such an honor to have Rob here tonight at the Lincoln Theater. Talking Food in Maine, you kicked off our entire series, and we not only talked about all the best, tastemakers in Maine, some of them, of course. I know there's tons more, but we got to go on a sort of a tour with you, which was great. Yeah. That was really special because a lot of us would never have a chance to do that. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to let Rob have a chance to meet with you folks. So while I pack up all this produce,
there you go.
And you're welcome to come take a whiff. And if you want to take something, I'll be generous. You can have some of the stuff. But.
Oh, Cherie, you don't do that.
All right, thank you all for coming. It was great to have you all here.